Hello, I'm Dominic Waghorn, and this is the Sky News Daily. Whatever the chaos and upheaval going on elsewhere, for the last few decades, the world has been able to rely on one thing: China continuing to be an economic powerhouse, helping drive the world economy. But is all that changing? The signs have been there for a while, but recently they've become more worrying. Deflation, defaults, unemployment and sluggish growth. So how worried should we be by what's going on in China? Are its problems contagious? Sky's Asia correspondent Helen-Ann Smith has produced some startling coverage of what's going on in China recently. Helen-Ann, thanks for joining us. For those who haven't seen your latest report from the city of Zunyi in Guizhou, it is remarkable because we're so used to seeing China's government and provincial governments building roads, bridges, railways, all at breakneck speed. And yet your report just has motorways standing still, half-built, bridges half-built. It looks rather dystopian. Is it worrying to witness it? And is it worrying the Chinese people as well?
These type of sites of half-finished bridges, empty apartment blocks, construction that has clearly started and then stalled, it's really hard to overemphasize just how ubiquitous that sort of site is in China. It is everywhere. You can take a train across this country, you just look out the window and you will see big old concrete pillars where they clearly planned some sort of expressway and then stopped. You will see roads that just literally stop where they are. The site of an unfinished apartment block is just honestly everywhere. And it really is the most visual of symbols, really, as to the kind of key thrust of the problem, I think, that China's economy is now facing. When China was developing and opening up, it drove this huge growth. I mean, we're talking figures of 10% plus of GDP a year for 20 years or so, because essentially it was an incredibly poor country that didn't have any roads, airports, infrastructure. And the model that they started to rely on was just borrowing a load of money, investing enormous amounts of it, and building. And they did that very, very successfully. And it all felt rosy and golden, and it was for a time. But it has flipped now, because now in 2023 in modern China, the country has what it needs in terms of infrastructure. And unfortunately, the local governments who have relied on this model of growth to achieve those big numbers haven't sort of quite cottoned on to the fact that this investment is no longer productive. And they frankly just continued building, even when the debt gets on top of them. They have no money to finish it off, and when it's completely unnecessary. So the result is the sites that we saw in a city like Zunyi. Zunyi's in the southern province of Guizhou, and Guizhou is one of the poorest places in China, but it is one of the most over-leveraged. The debt there is absolutely huge. This very rural province has 11 airports. It has nearly 50% of the world's 100 tallest bridges. I mean, it has so many things that don't really fit with the kind of profile of that province. We saw this big old expressway that was essentially unfinished, and we were able to just walk along essentially a 3-lane motorway without any cars, and it was remarkable.
But you've also been talking to the Chinese people, market traders and the rest of the Chinese are some of the sort of the best capitalists in the world. So the mood you seem to be getting from them is they seem pretty depressed. The economy is not going the way they had hoped after the government sort of reopened things after COVID. All those controls were removed after all that political unrest we saw. I mean, do they seem worried, and do they feel it's going to get any better, or are they seriously concerned about where this is going?
We definitely got a sense in Zunyi and Guizhou that people were quite angry, actually, about some of the infrastructure investments. I mean, one woman said to us quite clearly, this money has just been completely wasted. And why? I think people, certainly in parts of rural China, still live quite traditional lives. Many of them are still quite poor. And they see these huge projects go up and they don't see any particular benefit to their lives. Then you have a whole other class of people who have been really sort of quite directly victimized by some of the overbuilding. These big housing developers overborrowed, overbuilt. My favorite fact about China is there's actually more empty apartments in China than there are people in Germany. So these huge investments, it got to the point where these developers were so over-leveraged. The government actually tried to intervene in 2021, put in some measures to try and curb some of those excesses. it resulted in some of the biggest developers in China being unable to service their debts, defaulting on them. And essentially it meant these building projects just got stalled. And in China, what happens is people tend to pay upfront for these apartments before they're even finished being constructed. And essentially that means you have thousands of people who have put their life savings into an apartment that is just unfinished and they don't have it. So, people are really, really angry about that. And then, as you say, there's the other side to this, which is kind of people's businesses, people's livelihoods. Most importantly, the pandemic. China locked down whole cities on a whim. We saw thousands of businesses having to close, family savings enormously depleted. And people have come out the other side. And frankly, they just don't want to spend the small amount of money that they have because consumer confidence is in tatters. And the Chinese government really needed that consumer confidence to bounce back off the back of the pandemic, because a lot of the international demand they were getting. So remember when we were all in lockdown at home in the UK, we sat on the internet and we ordered things, we ordered home working equipment and we ordered all sorts of goods. A lot of those were coming from China, and that actually really paved over a lot of the weaknesses in the Chinese economy during the pandemic. That demand is clearly gone, and Chinese consumers are not making up the gap.
And there has always been this understanding, isn't there? I think since Tiananmen Square, when the government sent in its own troops and tanks to massacre and murder its own people, that the people would tolerate the communists staying in power as long as they kept making the Chinese people get richer and kept society stable. And that kind of unwritten compact has kind of held the state and the people together. I don't know what you make of that theory, but do you think that contract is being strained to a point where it is dangerous now for the Chinese government, or is it too early to say?
I think it's too early to say that it's dangerous, but I do think there are rumblings of unhappiness here amongst people who are feeling the pinch. And we really felt that in Zuni, actually. There was an anger there that felt more pronounced than it does here in Beijing, for example. People are angry and people are upset. And I think in terms of that social contract, there's been a lot of commentary here about how perhaps in order to return to some of that growth that China has enjoyed, there would need to be a degree of political loosening. So some of the, for example, sort of stringent measures that came down on private finance and industries and whatnot, perhaps would be slightly loosened. I think that's highly, highly unlikely because, look, Xi Jinping is one of the most powerful and controlling, frankly, leaders that China has seen since Chairman Mao. I think it's most likely that he has calculated that the pain will be manageable enough, that crucial social contract won't be fully broken, and that the other side of this pain, the economy will rebalance and the party will remain strong. I think it's worth just pointing out that here in China, things like small protests over economic issues are becoming a bit more regular than they were, certainly pre-pandemic. And I think there is a sense from people that life is not as easy as it was, and that's not always being kept private as it once might have been.
And do you think the people sort of trust the government, still have confidence in it, or has that been taking a bit of a knocking?
Again, I think it depends on where you are. I think broadly people do trust the government. You have to remember here that the media is incredibly heavily controlled, incredibly strictly censored. Propaganda is everywhere. And the vast majority of people who, it's important to say, have seen their lives drastically improved over a number of decades. They have seen themselves get much richer. They have seen China get much stronger. And most of these people credit the party for that. And this sort of blip that we're experiencing right now, they can quite easily say, oh, that's the pandemic's fault. It's the pandemic. It's no one's fault. The one other thing I would mention, though, about trust and how people feel is there is much more of a sense and a movement amongst young people that the system is not working for them at the moment because of this extremely high youth unemployment, this sense from young people that they've gone through this hard, rigorous Chinese education system. They've got their degrees, they've worked incredibly hard, and they can't get a job on the other side. There's been another trend where Chinese young people talk about becoming full-time children and moving back in with their parents to just care for them and make that their work because they can't get other work. So I think there is a real disquiet amongst young people, and that I think is a concern and a real challenge for the government.
Well, fascinating and troubling stuff, Helen-Ann. In a moment, we'll find out what impact China's sluggish economy will have on the rest of the world and how world leaders are feeling about it ahead of the G20 summit. Well, joining me now is George Magnus, an economist and author of Red Flags, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. So, George, thanks for joining us. I guess the title of your book gives a sense of your take on what's going on in China at the moment under Xi Jinping. First of all, give us your economist reading of this. How bad is it, what we're seeing in China at the moment?
It's fairly bad. It's probably not as diabolical as some of the kind of comment has been circulating in recent weeks and months. But coming out of the abandonment of zero COVID at the end of 2022, there were widespread expectations that China would experience the sort of bounce back that we did, and in Europe and the United States and much of the rest of the world, when we were all allowed to circulate again and meet freely, and all the spending that we couldn't do during lockdowns and restrictions, kind of we had this revenge spending splurge, actually, which was the origin of the inflation that we have been experiencing in the last couple of years. And people thought that this was going to happen in China too, but the truth of the matter is that it was quite the opposite. And so during the spring and the much of the summer of this year, the economic news in China was really disappointing. And I don't think it's quite as bad as, China is on the brink of collapse or anything like that. Service-producing industries are still just about growing. Manufacturing, investment seems to have kind of found a bit of a flaw. There's going to be some stimulus from the government in terms of infrastructure spending in the last few months of this year. So things don't look great, but they're probably not as bad as they looked maybe a few weeks ago.
And how worried should we be far beyond China? Because we're obviously used to seeing the Chinese economy powering the world economy. And if China catches a cold, do we all catch flu, do you think?
Well, this is an interesting question because China is the second biggest economy in the world to the United States. And it's the kind of the epicenter of world trade, really. So most of the supply chains of manufactured goods basically are built around the Chinese economy and what it does. So I don't think that here in Britain, for example, we will be in the front line, so to speak, of feeling the kind of chilly winds of slower Chinese growth. If you happen to be exporting commodities which are important to China's housing industry, for example, copper or iron ore or cement, steel, just things that basically are crucial inputs for China's housing industry and infrastructure. These companies and countries, Australia, countries in Africa, Brazil, Peru, for example, these countries will feel this first. We won't really feel that. But we will definitely sense a weaker Chinese market. If the Chinese economy is only going to grow by about 2 or 3% over the next 10 or 15, 20 years, which is, I think, kind of a generous prediction, then of course Chinese won't be importing as much as they used to. So we'll find it tougher to export to China and have to find kind of different markets. I suppose the other way in which a Chinese slowdown could be influential is if it leads the government to become even more repressive and more nationalistic with regards to its designs on the South China Sea, Taiwan, for example, then that could kind of become a big sort of a bigger geopolitical fault line, which could affect the United Kingdom as well.
Yeah, because the Chinese government are always inclined to blame the foreigners, aren't they, for foreign agents for things that go wrong on their own watch that they may be responsible for. I mean, there's always going to be that inclination, I guess, for Xi Jinping that if things continue to go bad economically, he can blame the foreigners. But that could sort of lead to a rather negative direction in Chinese foreign policy, and as you say, more repressive policies at home. Is that a big worry, do you think, particularly for G20 leaders who are meeting this weekend in India without Xi Jinping? He's not going to be going to this summit.
I mean, it's interesting because it's the first time that Xi Jinping hasn't attended a G20 summit, but the first time, I think, that a major world leader has skipped it. So if it's not health related, some speculation that it might be, but if it's not health related, I mean, it is a snub to India for various reasons. The Chinese and the Indians don't really get on that well over a number of things. including border disputes and obviously India's tilt towards the United States and its membership of the so-called Quadrilateral Alliance, which is the United States, Japan, Australia, and India, and a number of other things. And also because I think Xi Jinping kind of wants to champion the BRICS group, or what's now called the BRICS Plus group, because it's got new members, as the sort of global governance entity which China founded. It can sort of wield its influence much more effectively there amongst what it regards as friendly countries.
But as those world leaders meet in Delhi without him, how much are they going to be worrying about the direction China is currently taking?
Oh, I think they'll be quite anxious about it. Certainly the kind of liberal-leaning democracy groups that are going to be represented at the G20 or G19. But it's notable that the two leaders who are not attending are Putin and Xi Jinping. And of course, in a way, it's not an accident because Xi Jinping has, whatever their protestations in public, has effectively supported Putin's war in Ukraine and stands as a sort of an ally, so to speak, of Russia in its opposition to NATO and to the United States and to Europe in this regard. They will be concerned about what's going on in the Chinese economy, but there's nothing they can do about that anyway. And they just kind of have to kind of bite their bottom lip and just try to adapt and accommodate whatever the consequences might be. But what they will be concerned about is really the fusion now, as I would put it, between an increasingly faltering economic model in China and the growing repression and controlling influence of the party over all aspects of life in China. Now, that's a kind of a political and economic connection, really, which actually does not bode well, in my view, for international relations in the future or for China's prospects, to be honest.
And finally, it's not really the plan, is it? The plan was that China would get richer. As it got richer and more like us economically, it would become more like us politically. It would start reforming and becoming more democratic. I mean, what you're saying and what we've seen in recent years is the opposite is happening. And that's something we haven't really been planning for in the West.
No, I think that was a naivety on our part, looking back. I mean, I suppose there'll be some who maybe as long ago as, China's World Trade Organization entry in 2001, which was sort of a bellwether development in China's post-war economic history, they'll regard that as saying, well, we knew it was going to be like this. I think, it's possibly being a bit wise after the event. But it was certainly thought by President Clinton and other world leaders at the time that if we only opened up to China and they opened up to us, that that sort of political dictatorship and dictatorship of the Communist Party would wither, much as it had done in the Soviet Union. Clearly, that was naive, didn't happen, has not happened, is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. And we've had to belatedly come to terms with the fact that China is an adversary and would like to change the world in ways that we might not really like. But certainly the British government and British people, are involved. We are inextricably engaged in China in ways that we sometimes don't even know, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of the devices that are in our phones or fridges or cars or whatever they happen to be. So we will have to be very vigilant about the kinds of engagement that we have with China.
You can read more about China's deflation from Helen-Ann Smith on the Sky News website or app. See you soon.